It was a crisp morning when I finally finished planting the last of my tomato seedlings along the edge of my driveway. After 15 long years of working 80-hour weeks at the law firm, I'd found solace in the simple act of gardening. The soil between my fingers, the quiet hum of the neighborhood waking up, and the warmth of the sun on my back all combined to give me a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. It was the one place I could breathe freely, away from the stress of deadlines and the constant hum of city life. But that peace was shattered when I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking on the pavement. I looked up to see Karen, the HOA president, standing at the edge of my yard. She was dressed impeccably, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the morning breeze. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her lips were twisted into a disapproving line. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cold. "What do you think you're doing?" I wiped my hands on my gardening apron, offering her a smile, though it didn't reach my eyes. "Just expanding my vegetable garden a bit," I replied. Karen's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the neat rows of raised garden beds lining the side of my driveway. "This is completely unacceptable," she sneered, stepping closer. "Front yards in this neighborhood must be properly landscaped with approved plants only. Vegetable gardens belong in the backyard, hidden from view." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration at bay. I had read the HOA agreement from front to back. My property deed predated the HOA by over 30 years, and I had exemptions to most of their rules. "Karen? My property deed predates the HOA. I have grandfathered exemptions on most of these rules," I said, trying to remain calm. Her response was quick and sharp. "That's not how it works," she snapped, pulling out her phone. "I'll document this violation. The board will be notified immediately. You'll be hearing from us." As she began snapping pictures, I felt the heat rise in my chest. I had no intention of backing down. I knew this wasn't about a garden, it was about control. The morning light streamed through my kitchen window as I sipped my coffee, thinking about the violation notice Karen had slapped on my door the previous evening. The orange paper seemed like a petty nuisance, but it was the first real sign that things were escalating. Little did I know, this was just the calm before the storm. As I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, my stomach dropped. 3 massive tanks were blocking my driveway, their cold metal bodies standing like monolithic giants in the middle of my front yard. The sun reflected off their turret-like structures, and the sound of the engines growled like an impending storm. My heart raced, and I froze for a moment, taking in the absurdity of the scene. Standing beside the tanks was Karen, her expression smug and almost triumphant. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her blonde hair perfectly in place despite the chaos unfolding in front of her. Beside her was a tall man in an expensive suit, someone I didn't recognize. His demeanor screamed lawyer, and I knew immediately this was no ordinary HOA action. "Tom Anderson," Karen called out, her voice carrying across the street. "The HOA has authorized the immediate removal of your garden under Section 8.3 of the bylaws. This is a public nuisance and needs to be dealt with right now." I stepped closer, my heart pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "Karen? You've made a huge mistake," I said calmly, eyeing the tanks blocking my driveway. "You're not just violating my property, you're about to make a very expensive one." Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered, not willing to show any sign of weakness. "It's simple," she said, nodding to the lawyer beside her. Your garden is a violation. And it must be removed immediately. The sound of the tank engines revving louder was enough to make my blood boil. But I remained calm, taking out my phone and pulling up the records I had carefully kept. "I'd be careful, Karen," I said, my voice low and firm. "These tanks are on my property. And unless you have a court order, you're not going anywhere." The lawyer next to her raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting me to push back so calmly. But the crowd of neighbors that had started to gather on the sidewalk had begun murmuring. Sensing a shift in the situation, Karen's confident demeanor cracked for just a moment. This wasn't going to be as easy as she thought. The tension in the air was palpable. The hum of the tank engines reverberated through my chest, and I could feel the heat of the sun on the back of my neck. Karen's voice had lost some of its earlier bravado, but her eyes still glinted with arrogance. She was confident she could bully me into submission, just as she had done with so many others in the neighborhood. But this time was different. I wasn't going to let her have her way. As Karen prepared to give the order to the tank operators, the sound of a police siren broke through the tension. A sheriff's car pulled up to the curb, its lights flashing. My heart skipped a beat when I saw Sheriff Martinez step out of the car, followed by a woman carrying a stack of official-looking documents. The crowd began to murmur, their attention shifting to the law enforcement officers. "What's going on here?" Karen demanded, clearly rattled by the unexpected arrival. "We don't need law enforcement for a simple HOA matter," she added, trying to maintain her composure. Sheriff Martinez gave a calm nod. "Ma'am, I think you're about to learn something you didn't know about this property," he said, his voice steady but firm. He gestured to the woman beside him, who opened the heavy stack of documents and spread them across the hood of her patrol car. "These are the original survey maps from 1973. The county clerk, Ms. Abernathy, said, adjusting her glasses. "These documents show the exact boundaries of the Anderson family's land. And according to these records, Mr. Anderson's property has specific rights that predate the HOA and its regulations." Karen's confident smirk faltered as she stepped closer, eyeing the yellowed papers with growing concern. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "Ancient paperwork can't override the authority of the HOA." Miss Abernathy didn't flinch. "Actually, Karen, it does. The Anderson family sold the land to the developers, but they retained certain rights. One of those rights includes exemptions from future homeowners associations." She pointed to the map, tracing the boundaries with her finger. "This property," she said, "is one of the 5 properties that are exempt from your rules. This means that Mr. Anderson's property is legally outside of the HOA's jurisdiction." Karen's face turned pale, her smile gone, replaced by a look of genuine worry. "That can't be right," she muttered, glancing back at her lawyer, Robert, who was now flipping through his briefcase in a panic. Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat, his voice now carrying a note of authority. "I think it's time you take a closer look at these documents, Karen," he said. "These agreements were registered with the county in 1973, long before the HOA was ever created in 1995. The HOA cannot override pre-existing legal arrangements." As Karen's shoulders slumped, I couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about the truth. About standing up to the corruption that had been poisoning our community. The crowd of neighbors, who had been silent up until now, began to whisper among themselves. It was clear that Karen's control over the neighborhood was slipping. I turned to her, my voice steady and calm. "And those tanks you've brought to my driveway? They're parked on an easement that belongs to me. It's private property. Karen? That's trespassing." The bulldozer operators, who had been idling their engines, now exchanged nervous glances. One of them turned off the engine, sensing the shift in power. Karen stood there, dumbfounded. As the full weight of the situation settled in, the morning after the showdown in front of my house, I sat at my kitchen table, replaying everything in my mind. The documents had proven my point. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen's face, flushed with anger and panic, kept replaying in my thoughts. There was something more to this, something deeper. I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't long before I received a call from Eleanor Ramos, the sweet elderly woman who lived a few doors down. I had helped her with some paperwork after her husband passed away, and we had become good acquaintances over the years. "James? Dear?" Her voice crackled through the phone. "I saw what happened yesterday. I think you need to come by my house tonight. There's something I've been keeping quiet about. Something that's not right with Karen and Robert." Curiosity piqued. I agreed to meet her later that evening. When I arrived at her modest home, Eleanor greeted me warmly but with a look of concern in her eyes. "I've been suspicious of Karen and Robert for a while now," she said as she led me to the kitchen table, where several large folders lay open. "After the way they've been treating me, I started looking into their finances." I blinked in surprise. "What do you mean? What have you found?" Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming with a mix of determination and quiet pride. "You see, James, my Frank was an accountant for 42 years. He taught me how to read financial statements. So, when Karen fined me for something as trivial as my Christmas lights being up too long, I got curious. I started requesting the HOA's financial records." She opened one folder, and my eyes widened as I saw bank statements, wire transfer records, and even incorporation documents for a company called WCE Holdings LLC. "Over $300,000, Eleanor said, pointing to a particular document. "Was supposed to go toward community improvements, a pool renovation, road repairs, you name it. But that money never went to any of those things. It was funneled into this company." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What is this company?" "That's where it gets interesting," Eleanor continued. "WCE Holdings is a front, James. It's controlled by Karen and Robert. They've been skimming money from the HOA for years, all while promising improvements that never happened." I sat there, stunned. "They've been embezzling funds from the HOA." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, her voice growing more serious. "But it doesn't stop there. They've been bullying some of the older residents into selling their homes at below market prices. All part of their plan to buy up properties cheaply and flip them for a profit. They think no one will fight back, especially people like me who are alone and vulnerable." The full scope of their scheme began to sink in. I looked at Eleanor, disbelief mixing with anger. "But why? Why go this far?" Eleanor's eyes darkened. "Greed. Control. They want the land. James. The HOA is just the way in for them. And if they can force people out, they can buy these homes on the cheap, flip them for a massive profit, and continue to run the community like their own private empire." I looked down at the financial records again. the magnitude of the fraud becoming clearer with each page I turned. I couldn't just let this go. I had to act. And fast. As I left Eleanor's house later that evening, a plan began to form in my mind. This wasn't just about fighting for my garden anymore. It was about exposing the rot at the heart of the HOA and reclaiming our neighborhood from the clutches of Karen and Robert. The night of the neighborhood meeting. The room was packed. Neighbors who had once avoided each other, fearful of the wrath of Karen and her HOA, now stood shoulder to shoulder. It was as if a wave of collective realization had swept through the community. They no longer had to live in fear. No longer had to tiptoe around the whims of a corrupt HOA president. The truth had come to light. And it had ignited something stronger than fear, hope. As I walked into the crowded clubhouse, the murmurs of the crowd subsided. Everyone knew this was the moment that could change everything. I stepped to the front and connected my laptop to the projector, displaying the damning evidence that Eleanor had helped me uncover. The bank statements, the fraudulent transfer records, and the hidden LLC, everything was there for all to see. The room fell silent as the evidence spoke for itself. Over $300,000, I said. My voice, steady, meant for community improvements, was siphoned off into a private account. Karen Williams and Robert Taylor used the HOA's position of power to line their pockets, all while bullying elderly residents and forcing them to sell their homes at below-market prices. This isn't just financial mismanagement, it's theft and fraud. Gasps filled the room. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long was finally spilling over. The residents were seeing the corruption for what it was. And they were ready to fight back. Then, I revealed something else, the plan to remove the elderly residents. To force them out of their homes. I could feel the tension rise as several of the older neighbors stood. Their faces a mix of disbelief and anger, as the room began to buzz with indignation. Mr. Jenkins, a retired judge from the corner house, stood up. I move that we vote immediately to remove the entire HOA board and elect temporary leaders until we can hold proper elections, he said. His voice firm and unwavering. The room erupted into applause. The community had had enough. And now they were ready to take back control. Everyone voted in favor of dissolving the HOA board. And with that, a new beginning was born. Outside, the news vans had arrived, their cameras already rolling. As I walked out, I noticed Karen's car parked nearby. Empty. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction as I watched the sheriff's deputies approach her vehicle. Karen and Robert were arrested that night. The county prosecutor had already begun investigating the full extent of the fraud. It wasn't just a small scandal, it was a full-blown criminal case. And as for the neighborhood, it was never the same. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the community shifted. People began to come together, rebuilding what Karen and Robert had torn apart. Instead of an HOA, we formed a cooperative group, a community that supported each other. A group that celebrated individuality instead of stifling it. We created a new set of rules. Ones that allowed everyone to have their say. And most importantly, we were free from the grip of fear that had defined our lives for so long. And my garden, well, it became a symbol of resistance. Of standing up for what's right. No matter how small it may seem. What had started as a simple vegetable patch became the heart of the neighborhood. A reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can bring about the greatest changes. As I stood in my garden, watching my neighbors plant new flowers and vegetables, I knew one thing for sure, We had won. Not just against Karen and Robert, but against everything they represented. Our community was thriving again. Stronger and more united than ever. And that, I realized, was the true victory. What do you think about this story? Can you believe the lengths some people will go to for power and control? It's amazing how one person's defiance can inspire an entire community to stand up for what's right. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another tale of HOA drama, corruption, and unexpected victories. We've got plenty more stories coming your way, and I'd love for you to be a part of the journey. Stay tuned for more.